Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you love captivating stories about men transforming into women in unique and fascinating ways, then be sure to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Now, let's jump right into today's tale.
Kristin sat on the couch, her mind spinning as she tried to process what Daniel had just told her. Her grandmother's living room, usually a place of comfort and learning, now felt like an interrogation chamber, the familiar sense of herbs and old books suddenly cloying instead of comforting. The antique furniture that had always seemed charmingly eccentric now felt like props in an elaborate stage play where she was the only one who hadn't received the script. He wasn't just a warlock. That alone would have been enough to send her reeling. The revelation that the man she'd been sleeping with, falling for, sharing intimate parts of herself with, possessed the same kind of supernatural abilities she was only beginning to understand. But no, the universe apparently wasn't satisfied with that level of coincidence. He was the heir to the largest warlock family in America. The Carter lineage traces back to the founding of the country, Daniel had explained, his usual confident manner returning now that the initial shock of revelation had passed. My ancestors were practitioners in England, who came to the colonies to escape persecution. They established a network of magical families throughout New England, eventually extending their influence across the entire eastern seaboard. "So what, you're like magical royalty?" Kristin had asked, struggling to keep the disbelief from her voice. Daniel had winced slightly at the description. "We don't use terms like that. But yes, in certain circles, the Carter name carries significant weight." How the hell had this happened? Of all the men in the city, of all the potential clients who could have walked into her office that day, she had to fall for one who wasn't just magical, but apparently magical. Aristocracy. The statistical improbability was staggering, almost as if some cosmic force had deliberately engineered their meeting. How had she, of all people, ended up falling for a man with magic when she had only just come to terms with her own supernatural transformation? The irony was almost cruel. She had spent 2 months adjusting to the reality of magic, of her own altered existence, only to discover that the man she'd been rapidly developing feelings for was not only familiar with that world, but had been born into it, raised in it, had never known any reality but that one. "It's not something I advertise," Daniel added, noting her stunned silence. "The magical community values discretion, especially families with our level of influence. We operate primarily in the mortal world, using our abilities selectively to ensure success and stability." "So, quantum innovations," Kristin began, connecting dots that suddenly seemed blindingly obvious. "Built on hard work and innovation," Daniel insisted. "But yes, certain variables were occasionally adjusted in our favor. Nothing unethical," he hastened to add. "Just probability manipulation." "Luck magic," her grandmother had interjected, eyeing Daniel with what seemed like professional interest. "Similar to our family's specialty, though I suspect with different methodologies." She rubbed her temples, trying to work through the chaos in her head, but then something clicked. A detail she had almost missed. A fundamental inconsistency between what she'd been taught and what was unfolding before her. Kristin turned sharply to her grandmother, her motion abrupt enough to slosh tea over the rim of the forgotten cup on the coffee table. "Wait," she said slowly, her voice careful, measured, as if she were walking through a minefield of revelations. "You always told me magic only passes down through the female bloodline." The statement hung in the air between them, a challenge couched as confusion. From her first lesson in the attic, Gran had been explicit about this point, that their family magic flowed from mother to daughter. That the men in their line carried the potential, but lacked the channels to access it. It had been the entire reason for her transformation, to access abilities that Kyle could never have manifested. Her grandmother let out a rich, knowing chuckle, settling back into her chair as she sipped her tea. The sound carried a hint of that particular smugness, grand displayed whenever someone finally asked the right question. I said, "That's how it works in our family, darling." She smirked, setting her cup down with a decisive click against its saucer. There are others, other magical bloodlines, where power only transfers through the male side. The revelation landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of implication outward. Kristin glanced between her grandmother and Daniel, noting the lack of surprise on either face. This wasn't news to them, only to her. Different magical traditions evolved along different paths. Daniel elaborated, slipping easily into what Kristin was beginning to recognize as his explaining voice. The tone he used when discussing complex technological concepts with clients. Some bloodlines channel magic through the feminine aspect, others through the masculine. Some can access it regardless of gender, though usually with different expressions depending on the practitioner. The Carter lineage is patrilineal, her grandmother added, her tone suggesting this was common knowledge in certain circles. Their magic passes from father to son, with daughters carrying the potential but unable to manifest it directly. Kristin opened her mouth, then closed it. That made sense, sort of. At least it explained the gender-specific nature of magical inheritance, without contradicting what she'd been told about her own family's traditions. But it still didn't answer the million other questions now raging through her head. If Daniel was from such a prominent magical family, had he recognized her own magical nature immediately? Had he sought her out because of it? Had their entire relationship been built on a foundation she wasn't even aware existed? She felt like she was missing something. Something big. A crucial piece of the puzzle that would make the whole picture suddenly clear. "So you, sensed I was a witch when we met?" she asked, trying to piece together the timeline of their relationship with this new information. Daniel shifted slightly, his expression carefully neutral. "Not exactly. Magical recognition isn't quite that straightforward, especially between different traditions. I knew there was something distinctive about your energy, but I couldn't immediately identify it. Then, how?" And then, just as she was piecing everything together, she froze. A horrible realization crashed into her like a tidal wave, the force of it almost physically pushing her back against the couch cushions. A memory surfaced. A crucial conversation from her early days as Kristin, when everything was new and terrifying. Her blood turned to ice. Her grandmother had told her something very important when she first changed. "Other magical beings will know the truth about what happened to you." Those words, spoken as a casual warning when Kristin was still reeling from her transformation, now returned with devastating clarity. At the time, she'd barely registered the implication, too overwhelmed by the more immediate challenges of her new existence. But now, Kristin's breath hitched. Her stomach twisted into knots. She slowly turned her gaze to Daniel, her hands suddenly clammy, her heart hammering in her chest with such force she was certain they could both hear it. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into painful clarity as the full implications crystallized in her mind. Oh God! Did he know? Did he know who she used to be? The question burned in her throat, searing through every defense she'd built around her new identity. The possibility that Daniel, the man she'd made love with, the man she'd begun to trust, the man who had seen her at her most vulnerable, might have known all along that she hadn't always been Kristin Thompson. It was too much to bear. A sickening wave of panic washed over her, cold and nauseating. If he knew, if he had always known, then every intimate moment between them was suddenly cast in a different light. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word in the darkness, had they all been colored by his knowledge of who she used to be. She felt exposed, vulnerable, utterly raw in a way she hadn't, since the very beginning of all this. As if her skin had been peeled away, leaving every nerve, ending exposed to the harsh air. Daniel and her grandmother had still been talking, continuing their discussion of magical lineages and traditions, but now they both noticed something was wrong. Her sudden silence, the pallor of her face, the rigid tension in her posture, all clear signals that something had shifted dramatically. Daniel frowned, shifting toward her, concern creasing his brow. "Kristin, are you okay?" She barely heard him through the roaring in her ears. The room seemed to tilt, the familiar surroundings suddenly alien and threatening. Her focus narrowed to a single point, the answer to the question burning inside her. Her voice was quiet, shaky, as she whispered, "Did you know?" Daniel's brows knitted together, genuine confusion crossing his features. "What?" But he knew. She could see it in the subtle tensing of his shoulders, the almost imperceptible flicker in his gaze. He was playing for time, trying to determine how much to reveal. Kristin swallowed hard, forcing herself to look him in the eyes, even as her entire world felt like it was tilting off its axis. The question had to be asked directly, explicitly. No room for evasion or misunderstanding. "Did you know I wasn't always Kristin?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. The ticking of her grandmother's antique clock suddenly deafening in the quiet room. She watched Daniel's face, desperate for signs of shock or confusion that would indicate he'd had no idea about her past. Daniel's expression shifted, just slightly. Not shocked. Not confused. Just unreadable. And then he said it. Casual, nonchalant, tardy, as if he were commenting on the weather or the quality of the tea. Not at first. His voice was calm even. But I worked it out pretty quick. Her stomach dropped. It felt like plummeting in an elevator with the cables cut, that sickening free-fall sensation that turns your insides to water. The confirmation hit harder than she'd expected, despite having already suspected the truth. A sharp, breathless gasp escaped her lips as she shot to her feet, the sudden movement sending her grandmother's teacup rattling in its saucer. Her hands trembled, her legs unsteady beneath her. "Kristin, please," Daniel said, rising as well, hands extended in a placating gesture. "It doesn't change anything." "Doesn't change anything," she repeated, her voice rising with incredulity. "You've known all along that I used to be. That I wasn't born." She couldn't even say it, the words sticking in her throat like shards of glass. "Not all along," he corrected, his tone frustratingly reasonable. "After our second meeting, I started to sense the magical residue of a significant transformation spell. It took me a few weeks to understand exactly what had happened. But by then..." "By then what?" she demanded, backing away from him. "By then you'd already decided to pursue me anyway. To see what it would be like to sleep with someone who used to be a man." "Kristin," her grandmother admonished, finally intervening. "That's not fair to..." No. No. This was too much. She couldn't handle this, couldn't process the implications, couldn't bear the thought of Daniel knowing her secret all along, couldn't face the question of what that meant for every moment they'd shared. She had to get out of here. Kristin turned on her heel and bolted for the door, panic clawing at her chest, her vision blurry with shock and humiliation. The short distance from the living room to the front door seemed to stretch impossibly, each step taking her nowhere fast enough. "Kristin, wait," Daniel called after her, his voice tight with urgency. "Let me explain." But just as her hand reached for the doorknob, she remembered. The teleportation spell. Her grandmother had taught it to her just last week, a basic transportation enchantment for emergency situations. They'd practiced it in the attic, focusing on visualization, intention, and the precise sequence of mental commands needed to fold space between 2 points. Her mind latched onto the incantation instinctively, a desperate escape route. She didn't consciously decide to use it. Her magic responded to her emotional state, activating in response to her overwhelming need to be anywhere but here. She visualized her apartment, the one place she felt truly safe, truly herself. She focused on her living room with its comfortable couch and familiar surroundings, pictured it with perfect clarity despite her emotional turmoil. And before either of them could stop her, poof. A subtle displacement of air, a faint shimmer of energy, and then emptiness where she had stood just moments before. The teleportation was cleaner, more efficient than any she'd managed during practice, proof that emotional intensity could amplify magical effectiveness, just as her grandmother had taught her. She was gone, leaving Daniel and her grandmother sitting there, alone. In the sudden silence, Daniel's shoulders slumped, his expression a complex mixture of frustration and regret. That could have gone better. Her grandmother sighed, picking up her teacup with remarkable composure given the circumstances. Young love. Always so dramatic. Daniel turned to her with disbelief. That's all you have to say? Your granddaughter just teleported out of here in emotional distress. She'll be fine, the older woman replied with surprising confidence. She needed space to process. And you? She fixed him with a knowing look. Need to explain yourself better when she's ready to listen. If she ever speaks to me again, Daniel muttered, running a hand through his hair. Oh, she will, her grandmother assured him, a mysterious smile playing at her lips. The cards never lie, and they've been very clear about you two. Daniel looked skeptical, but a flicker of hope crossed his features nonetheless. What exactly did the cards say? That's between me and the universe, she replied primly. But I suggest you prepare a very good explanation. My granddaughter doesn't forgive easily, but she does forgive. Eventually. As they settled back into their seats to discuss next steps, both were thinking the same thing. Wherever Kristin had teleported to, the conversation was far from over. The moment Kristin reappeared, she knew exactly where she was. The teleportation spell had worked. Perfectly even. But she hadn't landed where she'd intended. Instead of her sleek downtown apartment with its modern furnishings and city views, she found herself standing in a place she hadn't visited in months. Her childhood home. The modest two-story suburban house where Kyle had grown up, where holidays had been celebrated and teenage angst had festered. Where a life had been lived that now seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The living room was exactly as she remembered it. Slightly outdated furniture, family photos arranged on the mantel. The old recliner her father still refused to replace despite her mother's frequent hints. The house was quiet, untouched by time, filled with distant memories of a life that no longer felt like it belonged to her. Sunlight filtered through the gauzy curtains her mother had hung years ago, casting patterns across the hardwood floor. The familiar scent of her mother's favorite cinnamon potpourri lingered in the air, mixing with the subtle mustiness that comes with a house left empty. Her parents were away, a 3-week European cruise they'd been planning for years. A stroke of luck, or perhaps fate. She couldn't imagine trying to explain her unexpected appearance, let alone her current emotional state. Her chest rose and fell with heavy breaths as she tried to steady herself, tried to stop the storm of emotions swirling inside her. The magical exertion of teleporting had left her physically drained, but it was nothing compared to the emotional exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. Damn it, she muttered, pressing her palms against her eyes. This isn't where I meant to go. But maybe it was where she needed to be. Away from her apartment where Daniel's presence still lingered, his scent on her sheets, his forgotten watch on her nightstand, his favorite coffee mug in her kitchen cabinet. Away from the reminders of how thoroughly he had integrated himself into her life. She had needed to get away, to think, to breathe, to make sense of everything that had just happened. Because this, all of this, It was too much. Finding out that Daniel was a warlock had been shocking enough. Discovering he was from some kind of magical dynasty, a lineage of power that apparently rivaled her grandmother's own heritage, that was another level entirely. But learning that he had known her secret, had figured out that she hadn't always been Kristin. Fuck, she whispered, the crude word capturing the rawness of her feelings better than any elegant phrase could. Just fuck. Daniel, the man who had made her feel normal in all of this. Despite the supernatural chaos that had become her life, despite the daily adjustments to her new reality, being with him had felt like an anchor in the storm. Their banter, their shared interests, their effortless connection, all of it had created a space where she could just be Kristin, without constantly thinking about who she had been before. The man who had made being a woman feel natural, effortless, right? With Daniel, she had never felt awkward or out of place in her female body. His appreciation had been genuine, his desire palpable. The way he looked at her, touched her, responded to her, it had all reinforced her growing comfort in this new skin, had helped solidify her identity in ways she hadn't fully appreciated until now. The man who had unknowingly, or maybe knowingly, helped her embrace who she was now. And that was the crux of it, wasn't it? Nothing had been unknowing about his actions. He had entered their relationship with eyes wide open, fully aware of her unusual circumstances, her magical transformation, her previous existence. And he had known, almost from the start. After our second meeting, he'd said, just weeks into her new life, when she was still stumbling in heels and getting used to her own reflection, he had already figured out her secret. While she'd been nervously navigating her attraction to a man for the first time, he'd been observing her, studying her, cataloging her transition. Kristin clenched her fists, feeling a mix of confusion, anger, and something dangerously close to hurt. The emotions swirled together, impossible to separate, creating a turbulence in her chest that made it difficult to breathe. Was any of it real? She asked the empty room, her voice sounding small in the quiet house. Or was I just some magical curiosity? Did that mean she had been played? Had Daniel seen her as an interesting magical specimen, a transformation case study to analyze? Had their entire relationship been built on his fascination with her unusual circumstances rather than genuine interest in her as a person? Had he just been humoring her this whole time? All those moments when he'd seemed so genuinely captivated by her, her ideas, her humor, her perspective, had they been performances? Had he been indulging her like one might humor a child, all the while knowing a truth she thought was hers alone to carry? Or worse, had he seen her as some kind of experiment? The possibility made her stomach turn. That perhaps he'd pursued her to see what it would be like to be with someone who had magically transitioned from one gender to another. A unique experience to add to his presumably extensive warlock lifestyle. God, I'm an idiot, she muttered, pacing across the living room floor. Of course, it was too good to be true. Her mind spiraled, questions piling up faster than she could process. Each new thought triggered 3 more, a cascade of doubts and fears that threatened to drown her. Yes, he had known she used to be a man before the spell. That fact was undeniable. He had admitted it himself, with a casualness that suggested he didn't even realize how significant the revelation would be to her. As if it were just another detail, not a secret she had guarded so carefully. But what did that mean? For their relationship, for his feelings toward her, for everything they had shared. What did his knowledge change? Had every intimate moment been colored by his awareness of her past? When he kissed her, touched her, made love to her? Had he been thinking about who she used to be? Had he just been curious? Was she nothing more than an intriguing magical anomaly to be explored and experienced? Just another adventure for someone who had grown up in a world where magic was commonplace. Had he just wanted to see how far she would go? The thought sent a chill through her. Had he been testing boundaries, seeing how completely she had embraced her new identity? Had their night together been some kind of perverse verification of her transformation? But then, why did he make her feel so special? Because he had. That was the maddening contradiction she couldn't reconcile. Ah, every look, every touch, every moment they'd shared had felt genuine. The way he listened when she spoke, the way his eyes followed her across a room, the way he held her as if she were precious, none of it had felt like curiosity or experimentation. It had felt like desire, appreciation, connection, maybe even something deeper. Kristin let out a heavy breath, running a hand through her hair. The auburn strands slipped through her fingers, a physical reminder of how much had changed in such a short time. "What am I supposed to believe?" she asked aloud, as if the empty house might offer answers. "That he knew what I was, and wanted me anyway. That he didn't care." She didn't know. And that was the worst part. Not knowing which version was true, the comforting idea that his feelings were genuine despite his knowledge. Or the devastating possibility that she had been nothing more than a novelty to be explored and discarded. Sighing, she wandered through the house, her feet carrying her on autopilot to her old bedroom. The path was so familiar, she could have walked it blindfolded up the stairs, second door on the right. The room at the back of the house with the window that caught the afternoon sun. The moment she stepped inside, a wave of nostalgia hit her. Not just for Kyle's life, but for the simplicity of childhood, for a time before magic and transformation and complicated relationships with warlocks from ancient lineages. It looked exactly the same, the furniture, the way the bed was still neatly made, as if waiting for her return. Her mother had preserved it like a museum exhibit after Kyle moved out, refusing to convert it to a guest room despite the practical advantages of doing so. "Your room will always be your room," she had insisted, much to Kyle's amusement at the time. The desk where homework had been reluctantly completed. The bookshelf filled with fantasy novels that now seemed ironically prophetic. The closet that had once held Kyle's limited wardrobe of jeans, t-shirts, and the occasional button-down for special occasions. Everything was as it had been, and yet entirely different, viewed now through Kristin's eyes, from her perspective, with her experiences coloring the memories. She hesitated before sitting down on the mattress, surprised that it was still clean, untouched by dust. With her parents away for weeks, the room should have shown at least some signs of neglect. Instead, it looked recently tidied, the surfaces gleaming, the sheets fresh. That was when she felt it. Something in the air. A presence. Magic. Magic. It clung to the space, faint but noticeable, like a whisper of something unseen lingering in the walls. A subtle energy signature she had learned to recognize during her lessons with Gran. The magical equivalent of a fingerprint. Her grandmother had been here. Recently, too, judging by the strength of the residual energy. The realization shouldn't have been surprising. Gran had access to both houses, had always been welcome in the family home, but the timing was suspicious. Had she expected Kristin to come back? Had she known that when pushed to her emotional limits, Kristin would instinctively seek the comfort of familiar surroundings? That despite intending to teleport to her apartment, her subconscious would direct her to this place of childhood safety. "You crafty old witch," Kristin murmured, though there was more affection than accusation in the words. It would be just like her grandmother to anticipate her reactions, to prepare for them with her usual 3 steps ahead planning. The freshly made bed, the cleaned room, small comforts provided for exactly this scenario. On the nightstand, she noticed a small crystal vial that definitely hadn't been there before. Inside was a liquid that shifted colors as she picked it up, from deep purple to midnight blue to a soft silver, like captured moonlight. A note was tucked beneath it, written in her grandmother's elegant script, "For dreamless sleep. We'll talk when you're ready." Kristin let out a slow, tired breath, closing her eyes. The thoughtfulness of the gesture only complicated her feelings. She was still reeling from the revelations about Daniel, still processing the fact that her grandmother had apparently known all along that he was magical and had said nothing. And yet, here was evidence that Gran cared, that she understood what Kristin needed even before Kristin herself knew. She was exhausted. The emotional whiplash of the day, combined with the magical exertion of teleporting, had drained her completely. Her limbs felt heavy, her thoughts sluggish, her ability to process any more revelations or complications temporarily offline. She needed sleep. The potion in her hand promised exactly that. Rest without dreams. Without the churning subconscious processing that would inevitably focus on Daniel, on his revelation, on what it all meant for them. She would deal with this later. For now, she just let herself sink into the bed, letting the weight of everything pull her into much-needed rest. The potion tasted of lavender and something deeper, more mystical, like starlight distilled into liquid form. It worked quickly, a gentle warmth spreading through her limbs, quieting her racing thoughts, easing her into darkness. Her last conscious thought, before sleep claimed her, was a question without an answer. If Daniel had known who she used to be and wanted her anyway, what did that mean?